Today, I'm going to be making a leather rifle sling. Starting with the slide buckle, I'll first cut 2 pieces of 1/4 inch square steel to a length of 2.5 inches. I'll match the lengths and square the ends at the same time with the belt grinder. I also need 3 crossbars, which I'll cut from 5/32 diameter steel rod. One of these will be 1 7/8 of an inch long, and 2 will be 1.5 inches. Each square bar will have 3 holes along its length, an 1/8 inch from each end, and in the center. First, these are marked with a punch so the drill bit doesn't wander. Then I make small pilot holes, then enlarge them to 5/32. The outside holes only go halfway through the steel, so I can't really ream them to the exact size like I do the center hole. On top of that, I'm not using the world's best drill press. That said, the closer the fit, the stiffer the buckle will be. If it's really loose, it might develop a twist. I'll just take the burrs off with some sandpaper and test fit everything together. You can see there is some initial wobble in the outer crossbars because the 5/32 bit drilled slightly oversized, but because the center holes were reamed, they keep it all relatively straight and square. The central crossbar should stick out about 1/16 of an inch on each side, as it does, so I can peen down the ends to make a big rivet, basically, which clamps the sidebars down onto the outer crossbars. So now that I know I don't have to scrap anything, I can go ahead and round off the ends of the sidebars and grind a small chamfer on each end of the central crossbar, about half the height of the rivet head, or 1/32 of an inch. This will help it mushroom over evenly and without cracking. Then the outside hole of each sidebar gets a chamfer for the crossbar to expand into. This means the riveted joint can eventually sit flush with the surface rather than outside of it. The sidebars get their sharp edges broken and sanded up to 800 grit. I'm not really worried about the outer surfaces yet because they'll just get messed up when I file the rivet heads down. The crossbars only get 600 grit because it's just a little harder to see any imperfections on such a small, round surface. The next thing I'll do is cut a small piece of wood to the same length as the inside width of the buckle. When I say length, I mean parallel to the grain of the wood so it will resist compression. This will prevent the crossbar bending as it gets hammered down, and ensures that the buckle ends up at the right width and doesn't bow inward. So that gets a hole the same size as the crossbar, again done in 2 stages so it doesn't get wallowed out, and everything gets assembled around that. I put a 1/16 inch thick washer down to keep enough of the crossbar sticking out into the middle of the washer to properly form both rivet heads. I'll give it a few whacks, then flip it over and hit the other side so the heads come out the same size, and just keep going until the rivet head fills the entire countersunk area. The support block can get split with a chisel and pulled out in a few pieces, then the rivet heads get filed down flush with the sidebars. Then the outer faces get sanded and the whole thing gets moderate buffing. I don't necessarily want it to be super reflective, just uniform in appearance. So that's the buckle done, and now on to the sling itself. I'm going to square off one end of a 1 1/4 inch wide strap that's about 9 ounces thick, so 9/64 of an inch. Then I can cut off a 3-inch section which will become the loop through which the free end of the sling passes to secure it to the forward sling swivel on the rifle. Then I'll cut the sling to a 53-inch length. The loop is going to be attached to the sling with 2 lines of stitching, which are marked from 1/8 of an inch in from each end to 1/2 an inch, and 1/4 inch in from each side. The spacing is a bit irregular, being closer on the sides than the ends, but I don't want to punch holes too close to the ends of the loop or the sides of the sling. All 4 long edges get beveled, but not the short edges because those will be butted together. I'll wet both sides pretty thoroughly with water, then gradually start to bend it until the ends meet, and then squash it flat. Even wet forming it, that's a pretty tight bend for such thick leather. While that's drying, I'll sketch something resembling a quarter ellipse onto a piece of paper folded to half the width of the sling, so 5/8 of an inch, and cut that out to make a template, which will keep both ends approximately symmetrical. Then I can cut the ends and sand them to 220 grit. The stitches to attach the loop run from 2.5 inches in from one end to 3¼ inches, and from 1/4 inch in from each side to 1/2 inch. Then all the edges get beveled, and it's time to dye. A reasonably clean and convenient way to do this on small items is to put the leather in a plastic bag and pour the dye in there with it. Make sure the bag doesn't leak, first of all, or the results could be tragic. Second, the leather needs to be agitated so the dye has a chance to get in between the coils. It's also going to need a really good soaking, maybe like 30 seconds or so, to make sure every part of the leather has a roughly equal amount of time to absorb the dye. So it may come out darker than with other methods. And I'm using Dark Brown Fiebing's Pro dye, which usually gives more even color than the regular stuff. I can then pour the excess dye straight back into the bottle and set the leather out to dry, taking care that it won't be sitting in a puddle of dye and that it's not touching itself anywhere, or that could also trap liquid and leave some blotches. I have been able to reuse bags for this purpose. As long as it gets swabbed out, there will be no large dried flakes of dye, and I don't mix colors. Once the leather is dried, it gets a coat of neat's foot oil. Too much oil can soften the leather to the point that it stretches under load. Not enough oil, and it can absorb enough water if it gets rained on that it stretches under load. I can't really tell you what the correct amount is. I think a lot of that damage prevention comes down to the finish and maintenance of the surface. When that dries, I'll put gum tragacanth on all of the edges and slick those down right away with a spent cartridge case to create a sort of satin appearance. If you wait until the gum is no longer wet, you can get a glossier appearance. That's just not what I'm looking for on a rifle sling. When that dries, we can move on to the finish. I'm using Fiebing's leather balm with Atom wax. Just wipe it on with a cotton cloth or something similar, making sure that no large bubbles are allowed to dry in place or they will be noticeable. When it's dry enough that a clean cloth won't stick to it, I'll give everything a good buffing. As a side note, the leather balm does not resist water on its own, so in the future I'll probably put Resolene or some other sealer on first, and then leather balm if I want the look and feel of the wax finish. All that's left to do now is attach the loop to the sling, so I've got about 2 feet of thread with a curved needle on each end. This goes through one of the inside holes on the loop, closest to the cut ends, and through the corresponding hole on the sling from the flesh side, or the rough side, of the leather to the smooth side, so the loop will be attached to the rough side. I'll center everything between both ends of the thread, then start saddle stitching toward the end of the sling, with one needle entering the inside of the loop, then exiting through the sling, and the other needle passing through the same hole in the opposite direction. When I get to the end of that stitching line, instead of passing the needles all the way through, they'll just go through one layer of leather and come out between the two pieces. Then I can tie the ends together with a little knot, cut them short, and stuff them away out of sight. The next bit gets a little tricky because the loop is going to be closing up as I stitch, but the idea is the same. One needle goes inside the loop, then out through the sling, and I'll center the thread, but I'm not going to tighten it up like I did before. Instead, I'm going to pass the second needle through the second hole in both the loop and the sling and start a very loose saddle stitch, so I can flex the loop open and get the needles all the way in there. You can get away with straight needles here if you need to, but they will distort the stitching holes more and can be a bit of a pain. I do need to be careful to avoid putting a needle through the thread, otherwise it won't be able to be tightened later, so I'm pulling it out of the way before each stitch. As before, when I get to the end, I'll pull the needles out from between the layers, but now I'll go back to the other end and start tightening the stitches in the same direction I made them. I can lift the thread with a needle and pull out all the slack, and you can see that will suck down one of the previous loops. Then I can tie a knot as before and push the cut ends out of sight, and that's the sling done. To attach it to the rifle, I'm going to pass the end forward through the forward sling swivel with the rough side out, then back through the loop on the sling. Then the free end goes through the buckle with a generous amount of slack, forward through the rear sling mount on the rifle, then back through the buckle. I do it this way so both ends of the sling are against the rifle and less likely to catch on stuff. The length can be adjusted by sliding more or less of the end through the buckle. The sling is deployed by simply pulling on the middle section, and stowed by pulling rearward on the loop. So, there you go. One of many ways to make a rifle sling.